Welcome back to the channel, and we have created a column. We've fractured the column, and now it's time to simulate. In order to get something a little bit more detailed and realistic, you want to add things like smoke and dust to accentuate the falling of the object. Otherwise, it just looks kind of weird. Now, not everything has dust and smoke, but most things, whenever they break, they do. So the first step is rigid body simulation. The second step is we're going to jump into Embergen and add some smoke. And the third and final detail is we're going to add some dust using geometry nodes. So let's start with an overview of what we've done already. This is the column that we fractured in the last video. If you are not caught up, the playlist will be linked in the description. So now we have this column right here, fractured, and if we hover over one of these and hit L, you can move those out and see that the fracture is good, and the topology looks pretty nice on the inside too. That being said, what we need to do now is separate all of these pieces. In order to do that, I'm going to go Tab to go into edit mode, A to select everything, and hit P to separate by loose parts. After that, I'm going to go out of edit mode, hit M on the keyboard to move it to a new collection, and call that collection column pieces. So now if I toggle this on and off, that turns on and off this collection here. So now we have this, and you can see that they're all individual pieces now. So the next step is to take this and apply the physics. So I'll right click this and click select objects, and that'll select everything there, and go to object, rigid body, add active. What that's going to do is that's going to make all of these a rigid body actor. And now it's going to go crazy because that is going to mess up everything. So in order to get this to work how we want it to work, we need to select this plane here and make this object, rigid body, add passive. Now I can go back and select all of these objects here, select this one so it's our selected object, and I can go through and adjust all of these surface response, bounciness, and all of that to just adjust the simulation as a whole. So now we can use these settings here to adjust all of these parameters here. So you can see the settings here. The first setting we have is our mass, and we're going to come back to that. Dynamic just means, does it participate in the rigid body simulation? Yes, it does. Animated is it animated? So say you have like a character animation and you want their hand to like fall off or something like that. It's a robot, maybe. You would use this animated checkbox to control that. And that can be keyframed, as well as dynamic can be keyframed. So what we want to do is, instead of convex hull, we want this to be mesh. Leave it on deform. And deforming is just, it deforms during the simulation, like kind of like a soft body. Play around with the settings and see what you like. As for the friction, I think I'm going to go with a friction of, alright, so I'm going to go with a friction level of 1, no bounciness. Our margin, I'm going to put that as the lowest value it could possibly be, 0.0001. And our damping and rotation are going to be 0.05 for each of these. I want this to stay standing until I make something hit it to make it fall apart. I'm going to go with deactivation and start deactivated. You can adjust these velocity, linear, and angular damping right here if you want a different type of simulation. But as of right now, this is pretty good. So we will select all. This is our main object selected, and we'll hit object, rigid body, and copy from active. That is going to copy the rigid body settings to all of the other pieces here. And you may have noticed something whenever I was just in the menu a second ago. Go back to object, rigid body, and we're going to go to calculate mass. So this is just a list of presets where Blender will calculate the mass of each piece based on the size of the mesh. So we're gonna go with concrete. See, it calculates the mass for each one individually. It's gonna be 28.1 kilograms for this one, and then 2.55 kilograms for this one. So you can see that based on the size of the object, it calculates. So now that we have all of that taken care of, we can go ahead and bake our simulation. So in our rigid body, bake. So now we have our simulation baked, we are going to hit play. And absolutely nothing happens because we started deactivated. So we're going to delete the bake, and on what we want to do is add some sort of object. So we'll add an icosphere and make it kind of small, and then we'll have it start on 0, 0 for that, 2 for that, and we'll have it go from -1 on the X keyframe, and then +1. So you can see here, if I disable this for a second, you see the ball is just moving. So we'll go T, add it linear. It just moves kind of straight right then. There's no anticipation or anything. So we're going to go to our graph editor, and then we'll select all of our keyframes here and hit T, go back to Bezier. So I want it to kind of go slow and then straight into it, kind of like that. So just kind of like that. So now that we have our collider set up, we're gonna go this and set up, and we're gonna set this up on rigid body as well. We're gonna go to rigid body, add passive, and click animated. So now this tells the rigid body simulation that this object is a collider. You can also put a collision modifier on there, but I feel like this works better in most cases. So the next thing we're going to do is bake our simulation again. And don't forget, in this passive rigid body object, we need to select mesh and friction all the way up and put our collision margin to a very, very small number. And we'll hit bake all dynamics. And don't forget to apply the scale for this, otherwise it'll mess up your rigid body. And this is animated. We want this to be mesh, and we want friction at 1, and we want the margin for collisions at 0.001. So now, and we are gonna go to bake, and this will take a while, so go grab a coffee, touch grass, do something else. When you're happy with the results, you can export this from Blender and bring it into a different software for simulation. I am going to take it into Embergen because that is what I'm familiar with. You could totally do this in Unreal Engine or even Blender with geometry nodes. And Sean Terrell has a really good video about how to do a fluid smoke simulation with geometry nodes. Check that out. But for now, I'm gonna just do it in Embergen. Now, how do we get this out of Blender and into Embergen and have the animation still work correctly? We're going to use what's called an Alembic file. Alembic files carry all of the attributes that I need in order to make this work. It carries the animation, carries the object data, and it can also carry the camera data. And I'll show you how useful that is when we get into Embergen. But first, we need to make sure that all of our objects are selected in the scene. So I've got everything selected here. And what I'm gonna do is I'm going to go to the first frame, go to cleanup, purge unused data blocks. There's not any, so we're good there. And I'm gonna go to export, Alembic, and send that to a new folder called Smoke Sim. And in this folder, we are going to make another folder called Smoke Render. And then we are gonna make another one called Objects. So we're going to store this column generator.abc in this objects folder. We need to do selection only, otherwise it's going to take everything from our scene. If you don't want everything from your scene, make sure you have selection only. Use instancing. Flatten hierarchy just means that any collections that these are in are going to be flattened to the same hierarchy, which we don't want to do that because these are a separate collection than these objects here. And let's do face sets, color attributes, and we don't have any subdivision or anything on there. Also, down here where it says particle systems, you can export particles and hair and stuff like that, and that's cool. You can do that, but we don't have any of those, so why include it in our Olympic file? After you've done that, just click on Export Olympic, and you're done. So now we're going to exit out of Blender, save before you exit, and then we're going to open up Embergen. Now, Embergen is pretty cool. It has a bunch of presets here, so we're going to scroll through and find one that works for what we want to do. And luckily enough, they have these collapse presets. So you can do particle smoke, you can do wall collapse, you can do bridge, or in our case, we're going to do a pillar. And if you're familiar with Embergen, you'll see that this looks really good. But the thing is, we have to input our own primitive. So what we have here is our shape primitive, and that is just set to a cylinder. So we can get rid of that, and in shape A, we're just going to modify this with an import node. Navigate to your SmokeSim objects folder, and there's our column generator.abc. So we're going to open that up and go back to the beginning, and it's very tiny. So what we need to do is put this into the camera, change this to camera 1, and we need to mess with the resolution on this camera because it's not quite what we need. It's 256 by 256, and we want, let's just do 1080 for this one. And so far so good. What you can see here is two things. Go out of our camera. One, this shape primitive, actually, this shape primitive should be deleted, and into our particle emitter we need to put our mask 1. And the reason we put our mask 1 in there is because we'll go down here and you see all of these items are all labeled plain. So for mask 1, we need to find out what item is what. So we'll go down here to rendering and turn off everything except mask 1 and see what that shows us. So for mask 1, if you select all, that should give you everything. So let's just start by zooming in pretty close here and select none. That's a fragment. 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 So it's safe to say that most of these are fragments. So we're going to go to the bottom one. That is our ground plane. So this one, plane underscore 75, is going to be our collider. So we'll go down here, collider, shape, mask 2. So we got mask 1 into our emitter, so we need to figure out what all we need to put there. Let's see, plane 405. Let's see if this is on here. Icosphere. The icosphere also needs to be a collider. So go to to mask 2. We'll go down here to the very bottom and do plane 75. We'll search for icosphere. Those two objects are our colliders. And I guess I did that in mask 2. So mask 1 needs to be select all, but remove this one and the icosphere. So now we should have something if we turn render all back on. Boom, boom. We don't need these two because we're not using them. So now it should give me something like this. All right, so that looks pretty good so far. There's a couple issues though. The first issue is all of the particles start spawning immediately, and it's way too big. The scale is completely off. So we'll go here to transform and click scale and center to fit. So our scale was just off. And now we've got all of this room in our domain and just this little bit right here. So I think we could probably stand to have it go up in scale a little bit more, probably about there. And it's gonna spread out quite a lot. So let's see what it does. Boom. And there is our simulation. But you can see that these are not emitting trails like we would like. So in order to fix that, we need to go to whatever frame this impacts and move this emission up here. So we need to go move all of these up here too. And then we will set this, go in our emitter, and then change this burst, turn it off for now, and then double click there to add a keyframe. And here, right about here, is where we want to start emitting. So we're gonna check that back on. So let's see if it works. And boom, now it's emitting, but it's a little bit late. So let's go back to the beginning and move to where about right there. Should be pretty good. All right, and that is going to hopefully give us what we want. We have boom. And what I want to do also is change this to continuous emission and have the emission rate be something like 500, something kind of low, so it's just trails. So we're gonna go continuous emission, keyframe, add one here, add one here. This one is disabled, this one is enabled. And we're gonna also go down here to after it gets all of them on the ground, and then we're gonna go and uncheck continuous emission right about here, and double click to add a keyframe. Just a couple frames before, we'll go ahead and add another keyframe there, and that should do what we need it to do. All right, let's go back to the beginning. So now we should have trails coming off of our pieces, and we don't, so why? Oh, that's why. Because continuous emission is not enabled on that keyframe, because I'm dumb and I missed it. All right, let's try again. Boom, and it's still not working. Why is that? Let's change this. There we go. Now it's working. A little bit too well, actually. So let's remove a couple zeros from that. Boom. And now we have trails coming off of our pieces. And the explosion looks a lot bigger. Kind of like that. Let's look at it through our camera. So something cool that you can do with Embergen is that I don't have to take this back to Blender. I can just use my camera and composite this in after the fact. As long as I have the same lighting that I have in my render in Blender, it's perfectly fine. And to do that, you can just adjust the directional light here with the azimuth is your rotation, and the elevation is the elevation. And you can also adjust the light intensity and the color. So you want it to be red, boom, you have a red light. But we don't want to do that. And you can also inherit the sun color. There's a lot of other settings that you can adjust in this software, like your initial shape blend. We can just put this into the mask shapes and not use the blend. And that gives us pretty much exactly what we need. So there's some other settings that you can adjust on here, like these noise forces and this point force. The simulation is one thing that we need to adjust before we bring it back into Blender. So first thing is, I'm happy with the voxel size and the scaling and everything of this. It looks fine for what I want to do with it. The interesting thing is that the time steps in Embergen work differently than Blender. So if you're at 24 frames a second, then it's going to be, this time step is in hertz and not frames per second. So what I have here is a graphic that gives you the time step hertz and the frame stride. And those two numbers go together to give you the proper frame rate. So in this case, I'm going to do 72 hertz, and under volume processing, I'm going to drag this out VDB, and this frame stride is going to be 3. And I'll do 250 frames because that's how many frames our render is. And you can export all different attributes on here. So I'm going to export the density and the velocity. That'll come in handy whenever we get into the dust portion of this. And you can also see there's a lot of like dust particles in here, and those particles can also be exported. So we'll go here to particles and export particles, and we're going to want to give that the same frame stride and number of frames, so that way the particles are the same as this. So something I've learned is that these particles, whenever you export them, you want to export them to their own folder, because you're going to have to do it as individual files for each Alembic. And I don't know what the issue is, why it won't let me do a single file to bring it in and have it be the proper animation, but this is what I found works. So we're going to go to add a new folder, and we're going to call this articles. And then we're going to add another folder. We're going to call this VDB. So our particles are going to go here into our particle folder, and we're going to keep single file unchecked. Frame stride is good. We can export none of this stuff because we don't need it. We're going to be instancing cubes on the points that it gives us whenever we bring it into Blender. The VDB, we're exporting this density and this velocity here. So these you can rename your attributes to whatever you want to name them. If you have naming conventions for specific things in your projects, you can just add your prefix or suffix in here. And I'm going to leave it how it is because I want to use these in geometry nodes. So we're going to go directory, smoke sim, and then we will go VDB and export now. And this will take about a minute, so grab a coffee, come back. Okay, VDB is done. Now we can export the particles, which does not take near as long to do. All right, so that concludes our time in Embergen. Like I said before, you can go ahead and do this as a render as well. Just make sure you select sequence and change this to 1080p and store that wherever you would like to put your render, and then it will go and render out every frame of that simulation through your camera view that you brought in from using the Alembic file in Blender. And then you can just leave it at that if you want. If you have a pre-lit scene, you can just let it ride. The cool thing about this is that it actually does hold out all of where the column pieces are black. It does hold out that, so that way you get proper depth whenever you're using this in a render. So it's perfectly great like this if you want to use it that way. But for my purposes, I'd like to control the lighting a little bit more. We're going to save this as particle pillar collapse and just overwrite this file here. We're just saving a copy of this, so if we need to go back into it for any reason, we can. If you would like more content with Embergen in the future, drop a comment, let me know. So now we've graduated to where we don't need any of this stuff anymore, so I'm going to drag this into our unused. The only thing we need to keep is the camera. And we're going to turn that off, and then we are going to import our Alembic file. The first file we're going to import is our object, and then we'll do is sequence and import Alembic, and Blender crashed. Thanks, that's embarrassing. So I lied. We're going to keep all this stuff in here and leave everything as it is. What we really care about is our particles. So we'll go smoke sim, particles, and bring all of that in. So now it is off somewhere right there. You see that? So what we're gonna do is we're gonna go and adjust based on what looks right. So if you recall, we had to scale it up. We had to scale it up by like 700%. So we're just gonna go scale it way down to like there. And that is not working for some reason. Let's move that to a new collection called particles. And then instead of just having this here, we'll instance this to our scene. So we have this as an instance, and then we're gonna scale this down until we get to the right size and position it in the correct place. It seems about right. All right, so we've got that in the right place. Okay, everything seems like it's pretty good. Yeah. Okay. So what do we do? So what do we do with this particle system? Well, what we need to do first is go into our collection with our particles in here, go to this particle system and see it has that right there. So it has a velocity attribute called velocities, and we don't care about that because we're just going to instance things on these points. So we're going to go instance on points, and then just a simple cube. And they're going to be way too big. So we need to scale down these to about 0.1. I think that works. Maybe not. Now there's quite a lot of cubes. There's a million instances. Over 1.1 million instances of this cube. So it's going to be very kind of laggy. It's like if you hit play on it, it's just not going to be great. But you can see here, we've got a lot of cubes. So what's going on here, and how can we make this go a little bit faster? We'll use a cone, and we will set this cone to have 3. So it's just little tiny pyramids. And then we'll set the scale of this. Because dust doesn't have a uniform scale whenever it is dissipated places, we actually, instead of doing just 0.1 on here, which that looks great, I think that would be fine if we were to just do it that way. But instead of just doing this, we can also go and, to help us in our viewport, we'll add a switch node, and then we will set this switch to is viewport true. We're going to random value boolean and take away a bunch of those. So what you can see here now is that actually takes away a lot of the particles here. It makes it run better in real time. I mean, you can barely see the particles. And to keep this visible here, we're gonna just check that pin, and now we have our particles, and then we can do 0.5 again, and that'll give us more, and we can scale these by a random value. And you can do it by a random vector, but I think I'm going to do it by a float so they're all scaled uniformly. I don't really care about the X and Y axis, so I'm going to do 0.1, so 0 to 0.1, and then that gives me a lot of randomness there. Okay, so there's our particles. So the next thing we need to do is import our VDB. Import, and you can see it's not anywhere over here because you go to Shift A, add a volume, import OpenVDB. So we're going to go and import this VDB, and you're going to see that it is not working. Why is that? Oh, that's why, because I did not import it the correct way. So you're going to go to volume, import OpenVDB, SmokeSim, VDB. Just grab all of those, import VDB. Bam, there we go. Now we have our VDB. We're going to do the same thing we did with the other one, but I'm actually just going to move this to particles because our particles are already like that. So bam, there we go. Set material, and then this is going to be our dust. Actually, we're going to make this the same as our column material because it's coming from the column, so it should be like that, right? All right, in the VDB, we are going to go to our shader editor and add a new shader to this. And we're also going to change this rotation to a random value between -2 pi time, or -2 pi to +2 pi, just like the last one. And you can see the volume is working. Something that you need to keep in mind is that whenever you export these particles from Embergen, it's going to give you a million particles, and unless your machine can handle that, it's going to be a problem. So what I did here is I went to our particles and I instanced, but before I instanced, I deleted most of the points based on this Boolean value here. So that should take care of that. Now we can go into render mode. Okay, so now we can go into render mode, but I'm gonna disable our particles so we can focus on the volume. So let's go to shader. We have our smoke shader, and this is where we're going to apply all of our different attributes to make everything look much nicer. But before I do that, I'm gonna make the lighting a little bit better. So I'm gonna go to world, go here, and then I'll drop that elevation to about 1. I will take the altitude up, and then we'll look at this way, and I will rotate the sun to give me some nice lighting. All right. So now we have this, but in order for this to work, we want to take the factor and plug that into our density of our density attribute. And now we have the proper density, but it needs a little bit of strength, so we'll add a math node here and plug that back in. So that is going to multiply it. So we're going to multiply that by like 50. That's way too much, so let's do 10. Seems like a pretty good amount. Maybe 25. Back here to this frame here to see what we like and what we don't like. Okay. So you can see nice texture and everything there. So this is our density. And something cool you can do is change this to velocity and then plug that in to our emission color. Okay, so we got velocity X, Y, and Z. Now you have something a little bit more interesting. So our emission is controlled by this velocity here. So the Z velocity does that, the X velocity does that, and then the Y velocity does that. And for our purposes here, we don't really need to use that. It's more of a geometry nodes thing. So we'll go set this to 0, back to the beginning, and we'll add another multiply here and multiply this value by a noise texture with a color ramp. And as you can see, it crunches that down a little bit, and this just adds a little bit more texture to it. If you go to a high number on that, put that color in, detail, roughness all the way up, and then this adjusts based on that noise. And I think I want to go to 50 instead. It's too much. Really, where you're going to see the most effect of this is in these trails. So that takes that. Maybe we'll put this up to 50. Let's back a little bit. Just play with these parameters to see what you like and what you don't like. Okay, I think I'm going to call that done. And there you have it. From start to finish, if you followed the entire series, you have created a column, fractured the column, and simulated the column to create something truly powerful. If you like the video, consider giving it a like and subscribe for future content like this. As a thank you to those who made it to the end of the video, project files and assets will be available on Gumroad for $1. See you in the next one.